Should a pilot be penalized when he makes an error based on incorrect information that gives him his own team? The Hamilton and Verstappen case in Monaco could change how the FIA judges the responsibilities on the track. Stay, because what happened goes beyond a simple sanction. The weekend in Monte Carlo started with very high expectations for Ferrari. Monaco, that narrow and technical layout where every centimeter of track counts, is considered a relentless judge of the true performance of a car and even more of the accuracy of a team. Lewis Hamilton, in his debut season with the Scuderia, knew he had the perfect opportunity to show that he can still make a difference. His acclimatization to SF25 has been intense, with simulator sessions, telemetry analysis and adaptations in his driving style. The team had worked intensely in a specific update package for this circuit, optimized to maximize mechanical traction and low-speed stability. It was, on paper, the ideal scenario for a demonstration of force. During the classification, Hamilton had been methodical, building rhythm with each lap and adjusting to the millimeter the braking references. In the first session, the Q1 occurred the incident that would redefine its weekend. The British was in a cooling return, trying to keep tires and prepare his next attempt. While traveling through the Massenet area, one of the narrowest and most challenging sections of the Monegasco layout, received a first communication from his engineer, Riccardo Adami: "Max is on a push lap," in reference to Verstappen. This immediately activated the space transfer protocol in Hamilton. He moved to the left of the track, out of the ideal path, a perfectly executed maneuver to allow the Red Bull pass without interference. However, in an incomprehensible decision, just a few seconds later, Adami updated the information: "Verstappen is slowing down." This new message, wrong and without foundations in telemetry, changed Hamilton's behavior almost automatically. When believing that the Dutchman no longer came in, the Vuelta launched, the British gently returned to the race line to continue with his preparation. What I did not know was that Verstappen did continue at the rate of classification. The Dutchman, with his usual millimeter aggressiveness, was just behind, entering in curve 3. Seeing Hamilton occupying the ideal trace, he had to abort his return. The tension shot on the Red Bull wall, and almost immediately, the formal complaint was raised to the race direction. What came later was a detailed and technical review. The commissioners analyzed not only the onboard chamber of both pilots, but also the acceleration data, the radio communication records, and the previous trajectories used by Verstappen. The evidence was irrefutable. Hamilton had crossed the ideal drawing just at the most critical moment for Verstappen. But the communication error of the Ferrari team was also registered. And that is what the debate turned on. The FIA openly recognized that the pilot's action was a direct consequence of bad information received, not from reckless or intentional maneuver. However, they affirmed that this circumstance could not be considered mitigating. The penalty of 3 positions on the grille was imposed on the argument that the ultimate running positioning always falls on the pilot, even when the information is incorrect. This criterion generated an immediate wave of opinions divided in the paddock. Many pilots and ex-engineer considered unfair that a sanction was imposed without taking into account the nature of the error. Others, on the other hand, defended that allowing exceptions would open the door to tactical manipulations difficult to supervise. This incident encapsulates with surgical precision one of the deepest tensions of modern motoring, the fine line between what the pilot controls and what depends on the team. And in Monaco, where the margins are non-existent and the punishment for errors is immediate, the slightest uncoordination can have devastating consequences. Ferrari, who arrived at this Grand Prix with the intention of consolidating his return to the elite, was seen again in the center of a media and technical storm. And Hamilton, whose only error was to trust his team, became an involuntary protagonist of one of the most controversial decisions of the season. This is where the incident with Lewis Hamilton transcends the scope of a simple penalty and becomes the starting point of a fundamental debate for the future of Formula One. Who should assume responsibility when an error for incorrect information occurs? The pilot, who acts by trusting his engineer, or the team, which provides that information? The case of Monaco 2025 has exposed with an unusual crudeness a lagoon in the regulation that, until now, seemed only theoretical. The principle that has traditionally ruled in Formula One is that the pilot is the last person in the track. That is, you must be able to make autonomous decisions, even if you receive erroneous indications. But this principle was conceived at a time when communications were minimal and technological dependence was not so critical. Today, a pilot receives a constant data flow, strategic commands, traffic alerts, and tire conditions. In that context, trusting the wall is not a choice, it is a structural need. Hamilton, in Monaco, acted according to what the modern track protocol dictates. Upon receiving a first warning, he turned away. When they informed him that Verstappen was no longer quickly, he was integrated again to prepare his next attempt. In his mind, that change in behavior was not an independent decision, but the execution of a strategy managed from the pit wall. In fact, his immediate reaction expressing confusion and radio discomfort barely realized the error reinforces that there was no intention to interfere. Only obedience to what they told him. During the hearing with the commissioners, both Hamilton and their engineer were called to testify. According to the reports filtered in the paddock, Riccardo Adami assumed responsibility for having issued an incorrect message, based on an internal misunderstanding on Verstappen's speed. There was no concealment or manipulation attempt. It was a human failure in the interpretation of traffic in one of the most complex paths of the calendar. Good faith was demonstrated, and yet the complete penalty was applied. The decision of the FIA not to consider the error of the team as an attenuating factor opens a worrying precedent. What message is sent to the pilots? Should now question all information they receive in the middle of a launched return, when their attention is 100% in managing the temperature of the tires, braking points and radio? Imposing the burden of evaluating the veracity of each message in real time seems not only unfair, but unfeasible at the operational level. There is also the angle of the regulation. The rules of the FIA are clear regarding the sanctions for unjustified impediment. But in cases like this, where there is no bad intention or negligence but a genuine error of the team, the rigidity of the norms seems to ignore the operational reality of modern sport. Several technical analysts have suggested the inclusion of a clause of shared responsibility that allows to evaluate each case according to their merits and not only for the final result. Ultimately, the dilemma is this: can an engineering so technified and dependent on the engineering continue to apply criteria that ignore that same dependence? Hamilton's case in Monaco is not just a sanction. It is a mirror that reflects the disconnection between the regulations and the real operation of the F1. And if something has demonstrated the history of this sport, it is that when the rules are not adapted to the rhythm of technological evolution, conflicts multiply. This incident cannot be as one more anecdote. It has to be the starting point for a deep and structural discussion. Because the next pilot to receive an erroneous order could be deciding a pole position or a championship. The penalty to Lewis Hamilton in the Grand Prix of Monaco 2025 not only reconfigured his departure position, but triggered a series of technical, strategic, and even policies that go far beyond a simple sports sanction. What happened in Monte Carlo has begun to cause seismic movements within Ferrari, paddock, and FIA itself. It is the type of incident that divides the teams, alters perceptions on the regulations, and forces Formula One to question their own operating rules. For Ferrari, this episode became another painful reminder of its operational fragility. Since the previous season, the Italian team has invested time and resources to reconstruct its credibility after years of questionable tactical decisions and errors in key moments. Hamilton's arrival was part of that renewal strategy, an experienced champion with a refined technical vision and a strong voice inside the garage. But what happened in Monaco exposed that, for more talent in the steering wheel, if the chain of decisions behind the pit wall breaks, everything collapses. Internally, sources close to the team have reported that an audit of the communications and decision-making system began during the race weekends. It is no longer just about avoiding technical errors. The need to review all the operational logic behind the flow of information between the engineer and the pilot is being discussed. Because the error with Verstappen was only the visible symptom of a deeper problem: the lack of clear and homogeneous criteria to validate critical data in real time. In a sport where a tenth can decide a title, that type of failures cannot be tolerated. But the impact did not stop in Ferrari. Other teams have begun to take note and reinforce their own protocols. Red Bull, Mercedes, and McLaren have summoned technical meetings to reassess how and when information on track traffic is transmitted. Classification simulations now include scenarios with erroneous communications to train pilots in the dynamic interpretation of ambiguous situations. The idea is to prepare for an environment where FIA has made it clear that the responsibility will not be shared, but will completely fall on the pilot. At the institutional level, the FIA is under pressure. Various voices of paddock, including ex-pilotos and renowned technical analysts, have begun to demand a review of the International Sports Code, specifically the article that governs the penalties for obstruction during the classification. The conflict point is that it does not differentiate between intentional, negligent, and a caused by incorrect information of the equipment. This normative ambiguity has been tolerated for years, but the Hamilton case has taken it to the limit. Because if a pilot who acts in good faith is penalized just like one who acts with intent, then the norm ceases to be a sports justice tool and becomes a source of arbitrariness. It is already rumored that several teams would be promoting a proposal to create an advisory technical panel that can evaluate these types of situations with a more contextualized approach. This panel would be composed of retired engineers, ex-pilots and regulation experts, with the ability to issue recommendations binding to commissioners in complex situations. The idea is not to subtract authority, but to provide it with greater technical depth. In parallel, the fans community has responded strongly. In specialized forums, social networks, and technical analysis channels, the debate has been lit. Most agree that what has lived in Monaco is a case of association guilt, where the pilot was treated as responsible only for being at the wheel. And that goes against the principle of equity that, at least in theory, must govern any professional competition. But what is certain is that it has exposed a structural failure in how F1 manages the assignment of responsibilities between pilot and team. If you do not act now, what was today a penalty of 3 positions could tomorrow become a decision that alters the fight for the world championship. And in a sport where every detail counts, the lack of precision cannot be allowed in the eclipse regulation of the talent and effort of those who compete to the limit.